Before we start, I wanted to pass those out. This is a new track that I wrote. I think I told you all about it last time. It's What About the Woman of Samaria? It's another one in a series of tracks that I'm writing. And this one here is dealing with the identity of the woman of Samaria and the fact that she wasn't a heathen, mixed-blooded person like many people tout. And I think you'll find that interesting. Thank you, bud. Okay, this morning we're going to be reading out of Ruth. I'm going to be finishing up the book of Ruth today. For those that didn't listen to part 2, I've got it on DVD if anyone wants it. We did part 1 out at the retreat last time. We went through chapter 1 and part 1 and just a little bit of chapter 2, and then in part 2 we went through the entire book, or chapter 2 in the book of Ruth. And in this one we're going to go through chapter 3 and 4 and just kind of wrap it up. It's not going to be real meaty, but we're just going to go through chapter 3 and 4 and kind of close the case on this. For those that hadn't listened to it and kind of don't know what we're going with, the identity of Ruth is often used to either support interracial marriage, which is a lot of times the case. And the other thing is the identity of Ruth is often used to support or say that the Anglo-Israel message is really no effect. And the reason is because most Judeo-Christian teachers, and by the way, there is no such thing as Judeo-Christian, that's just what they call themselves. But they teach that Ruth was a Moabitess by race rather than by being born in the geographic location of the plains of Moab. Now, to most people, that statement, Ruth being a Moabite is not a big deal. That's fine. It's a very, very loving multiculturalism story. And they kind of use it as that. In part 1, we watched the clip from the popular TV series Chosen, where they even mocked Jesus a little bit by calling him a Moabitist in tongue-in-cheek fashion, quoting Matthew or Deuteronomy 23. And in calling Ruth a Moabitess by race, we put into question not just Jesus' legitimacy as the Messiah, but also his legitimacy to the throne of Israel. We put into question the legitimacy of David, Solomon, and everyone after that, because only an Israelite could sit on the throne and rule over other Israelites. And when we make Jesus basically a mongrel, like many of them do, it puts into question those laws. And we didn't write them, I didn't write them, but God wrote them. And He put them into place before the book of Ruth. And we get to the book of Ruth, and when we look at it through a lens of, quote, Judeo-Christianity, we find a lot of issues with other scriptures. And we'll see that here in a moment. So let's look at verse 1 in chapter 3. And then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? I want to stop right there. The term rest here is noting marriage, because for a woman in those days, when you got married, you were under someone's protection, peaceful, you had food, it was considered a rest. That's how they referred to it. Today, I know we don't really see it that way, but just in those days. But that's what it was referring to. A woman that wasn't married was often, in poverty because of the situation, much like Naomi and Ruth were. Verse 2. And now is not Boaz. So Naomi is talking to Ruth and saying, now is not Boaz of our kindred. Now this term here is very interesting because it is, Naomi is acknowledging that Boaz is one of their kindred. Now, One could say that it's just speaking of the kindred through marriage, because Ruth was married to Naomi's son. He died, and then when he died, the Israelite law of the kinsman redeemer, the Levirate law, allowed for a relative, normally a brother, to marry her and raise up children in his name. That was the practice of the day. It was in honor of the husband, and it was also to help the wife, and make sure she wasn't put out on the streets, or, and make sure she was taken care of. So here Naomi is acknowledging that both Ruth and her, it seems like, are close kindred to Boaz. In the very least, she's acknowledging that Boaz is a close kindred to her. We don't know what her relation was with Boaz. Maybe it was a nephew to Elimelech. Don't know. Scriptures don't say. But there was a close relation of some kind, enough for him to be considered to be a kinsman redeemer to Ruth and be under that classification. So one has to ask, if Ruth was a Moabite by race, why would they really care about raising children up for Naomi's son through a forbidden lineage? Just one has to wonder what was the motive in that, but we'll see more of that as we go on. And now is not Boaz of our kindred, and with whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth barley tonight in the threshing floor. So he's harvesting barley. So it's interesting to note, and I hadn't lined it all out on a timeline, but we can see that Ruth and Naomi showed up in Bethlehem, we read in chapter 1, around the time of the planting of the barley, or the first harvest, somewhere in there, which was barley's an early crop. So that would put it somewhere around the time of Passover, which we know in the book of Ruth, it's a foreshadowing of our kinsman redeemer, Christ. So there's a lot of mirroring images that God's put in there to remind us of that. So it's kind of interesting that they showed up around Passover, and then this is sometime around harvest, sometime between the Feast of Tabernacles, Pentecost and Tabernacles. So just something interesting to note. Verse 3, Wash thyself, therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy remnant upon thee, and get thee down to the floor, but make not thyself known unto the man until he shall have done eating and drinking. Verse 4, And it shall be done when he lieth down, and thou shalt mark the place where he shall lie, and thou shalt go in and uncover his feet, and lay thee down, and he will tell thee what thou shalt do. This is an interesting verse because we have Naomi here telling her to basically go wash up, get out of your farming clothes and go get cleaned up. And then we have her telling Ruth to go lay at this man's feet. Now, at first glance, it sounds like something dirty is going on here, maybe, but it's not. What that laying, let's see, how does it say it here? Actually later on, uncovering of the feet. In verse 7, we'll get there in just a second, it refers to her uncovering his feet. That was an idiom in those days for sleeping. When you cover your feet, you were sleeping. It was just a Hebrew idiom at that time, at least in this context. So what she's saying here is not anything, no act that is inappropriate, but basically she's going to propose herself to him in some way and let him know that she is interested in possibly him being her kinsman redeemer and marrying him. And Naomi is encouraging it, which this is something that is very interesting because Naomi, let's just say that Ruth is of a forbidden lineage, meaning it is a sin for an Israelite to marry into Ruth. You have righteous Naomi here dolling up her Moabitess daughter-in-law and going and presenting herself like a harlot and going and tempting this Israelite man while he's harvesting his field. Think about that for a second. That puts a totally different light on Naomi's righteousness. She's no longer righteous. Now she's a scoundrel that is taking her daughter of a forbidden lineage and putting her before this Israelite man to tempt him. That changes the story completely. Naomi's no longer this righteous old woman that's just grave-stricken. She's up to no good. Let's look at verse 5. And she said unto her, All that thou sayest unto me, I will do. And she went down unto the floor, and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, and he went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn, and she came softly and uncovered his feet, and laid her down. And it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid, and turned himself, and behold, a woman lie at his feet. I find this comical, because can you imagine? Now, there's several things here that reason he may have been afraid. Adultery and fornication was a big deal. It was a death penalty offense. And for someone to find this woman laying at his feet, he may have been quite startled, that somebody may get the wrong impression. Just a side note. But she comes and lays at his feet to propose to him in so many words. And it came at midnight that the man was afraid, and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, Who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thine handmaiden. Spread therefore thy skirt over thy handmaiden, for thou art a near kinsman. Here again, the skirt deal, that is a idiom for marriage. She is basically asking for him to marry her. And she once again proclaims that he is a near kinsman. He is a legitimate person that can fall in line of the kinsman redeemer, which was only a relative of her husband, her dead husband, and only applied to Israelites in that case. Verse 10, And he said, Blessed be thou of the Lord. So now he just blessed her. Now think about this. If he was up to no good by thinking about marrying this illegitimate woman, he just blessed her. Now he didn't just say the Lord. Lord is all caps. That's the tetragrammaton. He used the name of the Lord. Some say Yahweh, some say other names, but he used the personal name of the Lord. So here he is blessing this woman that is trying to possibly make him to sin, which just doesn't make any sense. And he said, Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, which poor or rich. And now, my daughter, fear not. I will do to thee all that thou requestest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. Okay. So we have an Israelite city here in Bethlehem, Judah. And Ruth has not been there very long, maybe 6-8 months. And she's already known as a virtuous woman. Now, if she was a Moabitess by race, of a forbidden lineage, moving in there and trying to swoo Israelite men to sin, do you think that she'd be known as a virtuous woman? Of course not. This just doesn't make any sense. Also, in these passages, he refers to her as a daughter. Now, not a literal daughter, but if you look at that word, it's a sign of kinship, which is interesting. Much like I would call somebody my brother, but they're not my brother, or a sister. Not a literal brother or sister, but of the flesh, of the same people. So here he is blessing her. And then he calls her a virtuous woman and says that everybody knows her to be a virtuous woman. And then he commends her for coming to him because there's younger men that she may look to for marriage. Because Ruth is in her 20s or 30s. She's not that old. And I don't know how old Boaz was, but he was probably quite a bit older, maybe 50, 60 years old compared to her. We don't know. So he was commending her to do the right thing, do the lawful thing, and search out her kinsman redeemer in honor of her husband. These aren't things a scoundrel woman would do. Truly is a virtuous woman. She's doing what the Lord would want her to do. And he's seeing that. You could marry these younger fellows over here, is basically what he's saying. But you do the right thing and come do the Lord's will. Verse 12. And now it is true that I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit there is a kinsman nearer than I. So here he's saying that, yes, I am a near kinsman, but there's someone even closer than me. Now this kind of gives you an idea of the righteousness of Boaz. He could have just said yes, but he doesn't. Verse 13. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not do the part of the kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of kinsman to thee. As the Lord liveth, lie down until the morning. So then here he's saying, okay, I will marry you, but only if this other fella agrees not to marry you, because he is a closer kinsman to you, or to her husband. That's significant, because if Boaz was an unrighteous man, a scoundrel, wanting to intermarry with this non-Israelite woman, he would have just said, oh yeah, sure. And it would have been a totally different story. But no, he's saying, hey, there's a closer kinsman. Let's go see what he has to say. And then if he's all right with it, if he doesn't want to take you under his house, then I'll take you. Verse 14. And she lay at his feet until the morning, and she rose up before one could know another. And he said, let it be known that a woman came unto the floor. And in verse 15, and he said, bring the veil that thou hast upon thee, and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley, and laid it on her feet, and she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, who art thou, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done to her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley gave he me, for he said to me, go not empty into thy mother-in-law. And then said she, sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man will not be in the rest until he have finished the things of this day. It's into chapter 3. Let's move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 1. Then went Boaz up to the gate, and sat him down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by. Unto whom he said, ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. Let's stop right there. I don't know, nowhere in the book does it tell us who Boaz was in relation to Elimelech, or who this other fellow is. It's possible that this other fellow was Elimelech's brother, and that Boaz was a nephew, maybe. It's uncertain. Now, Elimelech's brother would be quite old. I mean, older than Boaz. So it's uncertain. Maybe he was a brother later in life that was born, a younger brother to Elimelech, and it's uncertain. It could have been although the scriptures don't mention it, maybe another son of Elimelech that didn't go with them, although that's very unlikely. So all we know is this was a closer kinsman than what Boaz was. Verse 2. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and said, sit ye down here. And they sat down. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, that is came again out of the country, or the plains of Moab, selleth a parcel of land which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought, I didn't catch that before. It does say our brother, but it's that's the elders speaking. So I think they're speaking in general terms. Our brother of Judea. But it's interesting though. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. And then said Boaz, what day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. So this is interesting. So we have kind of a court going on here. And we have the elders of the city and this other kinsman. And he's got rightful claim. Now, along with the marrying Ruth, they're also buying Elimelech's possessions, his land. And it seems like this other fellow thought, when he agreed to do it, he thought maybe he could, get in on some land cheap. And maybe he thought by doing that, Naomi was older, so he wouldn't have to raise children up with her. She was past the barren age. But then it seems like when he found out Ruth was involved and that he had the responsibility of raising up children for her, that he changed his tune and said, oh, no, I can't do that. It'll mar my own inheritance. So that means that it would have affected his own inheritance, his own property in some way. How that would be, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe that he would have more children to contest and not contest, that's a bad word, but to deal with his own inheritance that he already had, his own possession. So obviously, when he found out that Ruth was involved, he didn't want to fool with it. But it did not because of her, but more because of the situation. Because it says here in verse 5, to raise up, verse 6, and the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. So it has nothing to do with Ruth, but more to do with his own inheritance that he has. Verse 7, now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing, for to confirm all things a man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor. And this was the testimony in Israel. Therefore the kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe. Y'all remember the story that we read in part 1 about how if a man wouldn't take off, take the kinsman redeemer's or the dead kinsman's wife, that she would have to put in the public place and spit in his face and take off her shoe. This isn't exactly what the same thing is, but it's a sign of I was willing to not take her. So he's taken off his shoe. Verse 9. And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, ye are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his place. Ye are witnesses this day. Now we have, in this scene, we have an entire group of elders in this city. I don't know how many that was, but it was a lot among the other people that it mentions here. Do you think if Boaz was marrying a Moabitess by race of an illegitimate line, that not one of these men would have said something? That they were all right with this sin going on openly? It's hard-pressed to get a group of men anywhere and not have one of them object about something. I find it very unlikely that not one of them would have said, hey, wait a minute, what about, they didn't have Deuteronomy 23 back then, but they had it wrote down somewhere. What about Deuteronomy 23:1? Which, by the way, let's stop here and let's read that real quick, just as a refresher, and understand what sin people are saying that Boaz is committing. And not just Boaz, but Naomi. And now all these men that just approved of it. These elders. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1. And he, let's do verse 2. A bastard or a mamzer or a half-breed shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Not to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. For because they met you not with water, with bread and with water in the way, when they came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor and Pethlor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee, nevertheless the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam, but the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. Thou hast not seek their peace. Verse 6. Thou shalt not seek their peace, nor their prosperity all thy days forever. Well, Boaz is definitely seeking peace with this Moabitess by race, as many people say she is, in this passage. He's marrying her and doing well by her. But we see a straight forbidden law, or a law of forbidding that, in Deuteronomy 23. Then we have all these elders accepting it and okaying it. They're fine with it, which should hint to her not being of that lineage, but rather born in the same country. Born in the plains of Moab, taking the name of Moab. Much like people that are born in Texas are Texans, but it doesn't mean they're white or black or Mexican. It depends on what part of Texas, I guess. But it's where they were born. They have that name by what they were born into, what land they were born into, not by their race. But then there's terms for racial notions as well. But this isn't one of them. Verse 10, Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Melion, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren. And from the gate of his place ye are witnesses this day. And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman that is come unto thy house like Rachel and Leah, which two did build the house of Israel. And do thou worthy in Ephraim, and be famous in Bethlehem. And let thy house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, and of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. That just put the cherry on the pie there, cherry on the whatever. We not just have these people accepting it, but they're casting big blessings upon this marriage, comparing it to Leah and Rachel and the people that built and were part of the house of Israel, their ancestors. That's a big compliment, a big blessing. And not to mention, they're throwing the Lord's name around a lot in here. And talk about blasphemy. If this had been a conspiracy to sin rather than a righteous act. And the thing is we can only have it one way. You can either make all these people a conspiratorious bunch that were planning on rebelling against God in an awful way, or we can have it that Ruth was an Israelite, or of another people that the Israelites were allowed to marry in, which in part 1 we talked about the regions that Israel had conquered on the plains of Moab. There was Israelites living there, in Judah and Gad and Manasseh were living in there. And it only makes sense that way. If not, you put into question the entire Bible, because Jesus, having been a descendant of Ruth, you make him illegitimate. You make David illegitimate. Then you have all the things about David being being chosen of God, and Solomon would put those scriptures into question. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the woman said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. Verse 16, And Naomi took the child, and laid it into her bosom, became a nurse unto it. And the woman her neighbors gave it a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Oeb. And he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, Oeb, son of Ruth and Boaz, was the father of Jesse. Jesse being the father of King David. Verse 18. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begot Amminadab. And he begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon, and Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed, and Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. Now, because God's law would forbid in any other way, and it would cause such a muck to take this false interpretation that Ruth was a Moabitess by race, we have to come to the conclusion that she was an Israelite. It only makes sense that way. There's a book, there's a few pages I want to read out of a book along this same subject. I bought a couple of these. I got 3 of them. The Truth About Ruth, Ruth the Israelite. It's a complete commentary on the book of Ruth. Really good book. It is 320 pages by Robert Allen Balakias. It's a really good book. I would encourage you all, if you want a copy, I do have 3 of them. But on page 237, I wanted to read this section here. And he goes into a lot of detail that is really, really good. But on page 37, he writes here, One gentleman wrote to me and expressed his belief in a popular view concerning the purpose of the book of Ruth. He wrote, quote, One of the points of the book of Ruth is that love, whether human or divine, knows no boundaries or nationalities either. End quote. Which, that's kind of the narrative of Ruth. People use that as, it's a book of love. Love, you can do anything if love is involved. This is what he says. My answer to this is such a statement is fraught with falsehood and misconceptions. First of all, what is love? Love's in quotations. What is God's love? Is it love? God's love when a teenage boy gets a teenage girl pregnant and then runs off with her since neither of their parents approve of the union? What if the girl is of another race? What if the girl is the boy's sister? Can love truly cross all boundaries? Even moral boundaries? Establishes moral boundaries? Or who establishes moral boundaries? Is it love to let a toddler play with a sharp knife, a gun, fire, a snake, a scorpion? Because the child thinks it may be fun? Is it love to let a toddler drink poison? Because that is what the child wants to do. Is it love to allow a child to do only what he wants to do? Only eat cake, candy, ice cream. Only play and never study or do chores. Set his own bedtime. Not show proper respect. To make his own rules. Is it love to close one's eyes to the sin of a rebellious child and treat the rebellious, sinful child exactly the same as you would treat the godly, obedient child? Is it love to allow a person with a deadly disease to live among the healthy population? Is it love to allow sins and crime to go unpunished? Is it love to pass students who do not comprehend the course material or give jobs to those who are incompetent and unable to perform the task the job requires? Is it love to allow a woman to act like men and men to act like women? Of course not. The average person does not understand what love is, and the average Christian is clueless concerning what God's love is. God's love has clear boundaries which God Himself has established, permanent boundaries that never change and cannot be crossed without suffering dire consequences. Nowhere in Scripture is God's love indiscernible. Nowhere does God command us for our love to be any different than His love. For our love, if it is true love, is His love in us that we then share with others with whom and when it is lawful to do so, or to so share. God declared. I thought that was a good statement because that is the narrative a lot of times on what, like, not in just the book of Ruth, but all sin. You know, love, as long as there's love involved, it's fine. But what is our interpretation of love? Is it a godly interpretation? So that's all I have to say on the book of Ruth. I think that it's pretty clear that she was not a Moabitess by race, but rather of a lineage that the Israelites could marry into, or an Israelite herself. And with that being said, I think that the consequences of going the other route are too detrimental to even consider. And one has to question why a doctrine like that would exist in Judeo-Christianity when the Judeo